when I basically retired, I say basically retired because most of my career was freelancing. So you never know when your freelance career is over immediately. But I was full lancing. I always had work I could do for one client or another. So when that ended, in my mid 60s, I'd say, about 10, 15 years ago, I moved to New York City with my wife, Harriet, who is also a writer, and started living a different life, and a life without regular commitments and regular work. And I realized that if I didn't have some creative work to do, I would go nuts. So I cast around for something to do, and I decided wanted to tell the story of raising our child who had a very, very, very difficult adolescence. And I sort of saw how hard it is to address a problem like that in America, born in Mexico, how many professionals cross your path and can't help you, what it does to the marriage, all that kind of stuff, very personal stuff. But I wanted to tell that story so that I could straighten myself out and also keep busy. And I had a friend, dear friend named Kit Laybourne, who was an animator. And he said, well, how are you going to tell it? He assumed I'd do an audio version. And I said, well, my wife is really into graphic literature. She loves these graphic novels and they're beginning to be popular. Maybe I should try that. And I know how I can create an image because I can see the image in my head. So let me start with that. And so I wrote a book, which I have not published. It's very intense and personal. But the process ended up being the process that I followed with Fugitive, which was have a general idea of where I want the story to go. Let's say this chapter is going to kind of cover this period or whatnot. But I then would write maybe a few lines and then look for images online because it was a collage technique, but more like cinematic collage, where the collage is not about, hey, I'm a collage, look at me, but more like all these things I put into the collage are moving the story forward. So I would be looking for a specific image, like I think I want to see in silhouette the back of a child sitting in front of a river. That somehow feels right to me. And based upon what I've written so far, that might work. So I'd go on Google Images, and I'd suddenly be presented with 350 different images of what I was looking for. And to my surprise, each of them was interesting. Each of them had an element of story, an atmosphere, a point of view that would allow the left side of my brain, if I've got it right, or the right side of my brain, to kind of like talk to the left side, the other side of my brain, the part that wrote. So it was more like a collaborative kind of thing. I wouldn't try to stretch the writing more than a page ahead of where I was at. And then I'd compose that page, and that would help clarify the mood and the direction and maybe even the style that I was going in. And I became adept enough at playing with this piece of software that had a subtlety and a depth to it I hadn't realized. You could play with elements, you could throw shadows, you could blur out a background, you could intensify the image, you could make it semi-transparent, you could bring in elements that might be dreamlike elements or that might be very realistic, but they'd all be like working together. So the page would have to hold your attention and create a place that you would inhabit. But I wasn't sure what I would say next or how I would say it. And at the end, A Fugitive, which I originally saw as the story of what it's like to be a child going through a period of political conflict, and a father-son story as well, trying to learn what you can about who your father really is and his spirit. And, after I finished that, it suddenly occurred to me, no, I got to bring this story. That'll work as a story. Anybody who reads it, who's interested, is going to understand a lot of what's going on, the politics as well as the family stuff. But I want to bring it up to date. And so I did an epilogue. And in the epilogue, which is in a slightly different style, which again surprised me, I tell the story of what it was like to finally have my father's FBI files. Years and years after he died, years and years after J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, died, when this stuff could be made public under the Freedom of Information Act. And I learned so many things about what was going on from that, that I said, this is the final part of the story. This is going to bring it up to the present. And this is what I think I took from all of this, what it means, what to look out for what not. It's a little cautionary, but what struck me was that that came with a style of its own. It said, this part is going to have to be about physically what happens when you open up a formally confidential file and you learn all about your private life and who was looking in on it and who did the looking. And you know, even though names of informers would be concealed, they would be edited out by the FBI before they'd send you the file. You often, from internal evidence, you could know what was going on or who was the informer. And I mean, the surprises were incredible. The first part is about what it's like to live through this period. The second part was like, you think you understand it, and then you see, oh my God, it's even stranger than you realize. So I always felt comfortable doing that. It seemed like I have, even when I was working in radio, you'd still storyboard the story. You could still imagine. You wanted people to imagine certain details, so you'd see them in your own head first and figure out how to arrange them. So I had a facility with working with imagery, but I'd never been an illustrator. So, you know, I had all of the negative, you know, discouraging attitudes about, oh, I can't illustrate this. I don't know how to illustrate. Turns out I did know how to illustrate it, but in a style that the software helped me with. At least I hope people, what I've heard from people is they don't have, nobody thinks that it's an amateur job.